The shadows within the grand synod of the Ethelgard were not merely the absence of light. They were a curated aesthetic, a deliberate manipulation of the atmosphere designed to crush the spirit of any petitioner foolish enough to stand before the High Council. The chamber was a cavernous hollow carved from the living obsidian of their homeworld's mantle, a space so vast that the ceiling was lost in a haze of localized nebulas and gravity-dampening fields. Here the air tasted of ozone and ancient dust, recycled through filtration systems that had been humming since before the first mammal crawled from the mud of Terra. High Counselor Vrexian sat upon the central dais, his chitinous form draped in the iridescent robes of his station, the fabric shimmering with the trapped light of dying stars. He did not move, for movement was a sign of urgency, and the Ethelgard had not known urgency for 10,000 cycles. To be Ethelgard was to be eternal, stagnant, and absolute. Around him, in concentric semicircles rising high into the gloom, sat the representatives of the vassal species, the client states, the conquered, the economically annexed. They were silent, for speech was permitted only when granted, and Vrexian had granted nothing but his suffocating presence for the last 3 standard hours. The silence was a weapon, a heavy blanket of political pressure that weighed upon the soul. Vrexian's compound eyes, faceted and glowing with a dull amber bioluminescence, flickered toward the holographic projection floating in the center of the intake floor. It displayed a sector of space that the Empire had long ago designated as a waste zone, a graveyard of physics and failed ambitions. Sector 90. To the Galactic Council, it was known as the Blight. To the humans, the newest and most primitive addition to the galactic stage, it had been a gift. A generous, benevolent gift, or so the diplomatic transcripts claimed. In reality, it was a sentence. The Ethelgard did not wage war with kinetic bombardment or plasma fire if they could avoid it. Such things were messy and wasted resources. Instead, they waged war with bureaucracy, with impossible logistics, and with gifts that were curses in disguise. They had given the humans the Blight, a region of space filled with the shattered remnants of a precursor megastructure, a Dyson swarm torn apart by gravitational shear and infested with leaking radiation that defied shielding. The logic had been simple, cold, and flawless. The humans, eager for technology and recognition, would accept the sector. They would bankrupt their fragile economy trying to salvage the wreckage. The radiation would sterilize their gene pool over a few generations, and the sheer impossibility of the engineering required to stabilize the sector would break their spirit. It was a slow annihilation, a degradation of potential. "Report," Vrexian finally whispered, his voice a dry rasp that was amplified by the acoustics of the chamber until it sounded like shifting tectonic plates. "The silence from the Terran containment zone has persisted for 5 cycles. Verify their economic collapse." The tactician, a spindly creature named Calith from the warrior caste, stepped forward into the circle of light. Calith's armor was fused to his exoskeleton, a sign of his eternal service, but even he seemed hesitant, his mandibles clicking together in a nervous rhythm that betrayed the stoicism expected of his rank. He manipulated the control interface with 3 articulate claws, bringing the holographic map of Sector 90 into sharper focus. The image was meant to show a field of debris, a chaotic swirl of metal and dying energy. It was meant to show the flickering, desperate distress beacons of human salvage ships tearing themselves apart against the uncaring void. But the image did not resolve into chaos. The hologram flickered, stabilized, and then displayed something that caused a ripple of unease to travel through the assembled vassal representatives. The Blight was gone. In its place was a geometric perfection that hurt the eyes to look at. The swirling debris field had been organized. The millions of kilometers of jagged hull plating, the megatons of radioactive isotopes, the fractured gravity wells, they were not floating aimlessly. They had been seized, straightened, and welded. "High Counselor," Calith said, his voice trembling slightly, a frequency of fear that the translators struggled to parse. We are having difficulty interpreting the sensor data. The diagnostic algorithms claim the sensors are malfunctioning, but we have run 3 independent sweeps using the deep void arrays on the perimeter." "Malfunctioning?" Vrexian's tone remained level, but the amber light in his eyes dimmed, a sign of displeasure. "The sensors of the Ethelgard do not malfunction, tactician. Explain the visual. Why does the graveyard look structured?" Calith tapped a command, zooming the projection. It is not merely structured, High Counselor. It is active. The radiation leakage from the fractured singularity cores, the environmental hazard we relied upon to degrade their biology, it has dropped to 0. Background count is lower than the ambient radiation of this very chamber. Vrexian leaned forward, the carapace of his thorax grinding against the throne. Impossible. The cores in Sector 90 were breached. They were bleeding entropy into real space. To seal them would require the energy output of a Type 2 civilization and materials we ourselves do not possess. The humans are scavengers. They bang rocks together and call it fission. They did not seal them, Calith corrected, and now the fear in his voice was unmistakable. They directed them. The hologram shifted again, displaying energy flow charts. Thick lines of violet pulsing light ran through the lattice of the reconstructed megastructure like veins in a living god. The humans hadn't capped the leaking radiation. They had built conduits. They had constructed a vascular system out of the wreckage, funneling the lethal energies into a central collection point. The sheer scale of the engineering was nauseating. It implied a level of industry that shouldn't have been possible for a species that had only discovered faster-than-light travel a century ago. It suggested that every human, every machine, every ounce of resource in their possession had been dedicated to this singular task for the last decade, without rest, without sleep, without error. Directed it where? Vrexian demanded, his claws gripping the armrests of his throne, gouging deep grooves into the ancient stone. To the primary weapon systems, Calith whispered. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the curated silence of the Ethelguard's intimidation. It was the silence of prey that realizes the predator is already inside the burrow. Weapon systems, Vrexian repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. The wreckage was industrial, mining platforms, refineries. There were no weapon systems in the Blight. That is why we gave it to them. It was harmless trash. It was trash, High Counselor, Calith said. But the Terrans, they did not restore the precursor designs. They cannibalized them. They took the gravity shears from the mining drones and inverted them. They took the radiation shielding and weaponized the absorption arrays. They looked at the wreckage of a civilization that died of madness, and they saw raw materials for a fortress. A low murmur broke out among the vassals. The species who had long bowed to the Ethelguard, who had accepted their own gifts of limited technology and trade agreements that shackled them to debt, began to shift in their seats. They exchanged glances, quick, terrified, and speculative. The Ethelguard dominion was built on the perception of absolute superiority. If a species of hairless apes from a death world could take a garbage dump and turn it into a loaded gun, that perception was in danger of shattering. Silence, Vrexian roared, the sound amplified by the chamber to a deafening boom. This is a trick, a sensor ghost, a holographic decoy. The humans are deceptive by nature. They are trying to bluff us into granting them more resources. They are likely starving in the dark, projecting this image to hide their corpses. Prepare the suppression fleet. We will jump to Sector 90 and remind them of their place. We will burn this illusion and the scavengers hiding behind it. High Counselor, a new voice cut through the air. It was deep, resonant, and calm. It did not come from the tactician, nor from the vassals. It came from the center of the room, from the communication relay that was supposed to be locked down to all but authorized Ethelguard frequencies. Vrexian froze. The security protocols of the Grand Synod were impenetrable. To bypass them required quantum keys that changed every nanosecond. Who speaks? Vrexian hissed, his eyes scanning the room. The holographic map of the Blight flickered and vanished. In its place, a figure appeared. It was a human. He was seated, not standing, in a chair that looked like it had been welded together from scrap metal, yet it possessed a brutal, utilitarian elegance. He wore a uniform of dark gray, unadorned by medals or gold braid. His face was lined with exhaustion, his skin pale, his eyes dark and hard like flint. He looked nothing like the polished, desperate diplomats the humans had sent years ago. He looked like a man who had spent 10 years walking through a radioactive fire and had come out the other side carrying the flame. I am Admiral Elias Thorne, the human said. His voice was not loud, yet it carried a weight that the amplified shouts of the High Counselor lacked. Commanding officer of the Terran Reclamation Fleet, and I am afraid you will not be burning anything today, Counselor. We have calibrated the thermal tolerances of our new home Q. You ate carefully, your plasma fire would be inefficient. Vrexian rose to his full height, his 4 arms spreading wide in a display of dominance. You dare intrude upon this frequency? You dare speak to the Synod without prostration? We gave you a sector of space out of pity, human. We gave you the means to expand. You gave us a wreck, Thorne interrupted. He didn't shout. He didn't seem angry. He sounded like a teacher correcting a slow student. You gave us a graveyard. You looked at the twisted metal and the leaking cores and the madness of the geometry, and you thought it would kill us. You thought we would look at the broken things and despair. Thorn leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. But you forgot something about humanity, Vrexian. You forgot where we come from. We didn't evolve in a garden. We evolved in the ice, in the drought, in the scarcity. We are not a species that discards things because they are broken. We are a species that fixes. When our tools break, we mend them. When our bones break, we knit them. When our world breaks, we rebuild it. You gave us the greatest puzzle in the history of the galaxy. You gave us millions of tons of high-grade precursor alloy, infinite energy sources that just needed a little discipline. And you gave us the isolation to work on it without your interference. It was refuse, Vrexian spat. It was useless slag. To you, perhaps, Thorn said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. But one man's trash is another man's battleship. You see, we didn't just fix the station, Counselor. We learned from it. We reverse-engineered the stress fractures to understand the weapons that caused them. We analyzed the radiation leaks to understand the engines that powered them. You gave us the blueprints of gods, shredded and torn, and you assumed we were too stupid to tape them back together. This is insolence, Calith the tactician shouted, though he was backing away from the projection. We have fleets numbering in the thousands. We have the Star Crushers. We have the loyalty of 100 worlds. Do you? Thorn asked softly. He looked up, his eyes seeming to pierce through the hologram and scan the faces of the vassal representatives in the nosebleed seats. Do you have their loyalty, or do you have their fear? Because fear is brittle, tactician. Fear breaks when it sees something stronger than the thing it fears. We are the Ethelgard, Vrexian screamed, losing his composure entirely. We are the architects of the galaxy. You are nothing but dust crawlers. We will annihilate you. Thorn's expression hardened. The weariness vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. Annihilation, he mused. That's a strong word. You intended for the wreck to annihilate us. Slowly, through entropy. But you see, when you handed us that sector, you handed us a loaded gun, barrel first. We just took the time to turn it around. The human admiral tapped a control on his armrest. You threat to come to us, save your fuel. We are already here. A deep, reverberating thrum shook the obsidian spire. It was not a sound heard with ears, but felt in the marrow of the bone. It was the displacement of space on a planetary scale. Sensors all over the chamber began to scream, their warning klaxons merging into a single, terrifying wail. Proximity alert, a drone operator shrieked from the pit. High orbit, something has just exited subspace. It is massive. It registers as a moon-sized object. On screen, Vrexian commanded, his voice cracking. The image of the human admiral minimized, shifting to the side to reveal the live feed from the orbital defense grid. Above the violet swirling clouds of the Ethelgard homeworld, the void had torn open. Emerging from the tier was not a sleek, elegant ship of white ceramic and light like the Ethelgard vessels. This thing was a monstrosity of function. It was dark, jagged, and brutal. It was clearly constructed from the cannibalized remains of the precursor ring world. Massive girders, miles long, formed a speartip hull. Engines the size of cities burned with a blue-white ferocity that outshone the local sun. It was an ugly, scarred, terrifying beast of a ship, held together by welds and willpower, bristling with more weapon batteries than the entire Ethelgard home fleet combined. It was the Resolute, and it was made of the very garbage Vrexian had laughed about giving away. You gave us a wreck, Thorn's voice returned, echoing through the chamber, and we are returning the investment with interest. The Resolute didn't fire. It simply powered up its main array. The energy reading spiked so high that the sensors in the Synod chamber overloaded and sparked, showering the delegates in sparks. The Ethelgard fleet, holding station in orbit, scattered like minnows before a shark. They couldn't fight this. The sheer mass of the Terran vessel generated its own gravity well, disrupting the formation of the lighter alley. "End cruisers." "Surrender is not required," Thorn said, his voice calm again. "We did not come here to conquer you. We have enough space in the sector you gave us. We are quite busy building, but we came to deliver a message. The era of your stagnation is over. The Blight is now the Terran bastion, and we are declaring it a sovereign exclusion zone. Any vessel entering our space without invitation will be dismantled and added to the hull. We are very efficient at recycling." Vrexian sank back into his throne. The humiliation was total. He looked at the vassals, and for the first time in centuries he saw heads raised. He saw eyes meeting his not with submission, but with calculation. The humans had not just built a ship. They had broken the spell of Ethelgard invincibility. They had proven that the refuse of the Empire could rise up and choke the Emperor. "Why," Vrexian whispered, realizing the microphone was still live. "You could have destroyed us with that power. You could have wiped this city from the map. Why simply threaten?" Thorn paused. He looked down as if consulting a data pad, then looked back up. "Because, Counselor, unlike you, we don't believe in waste. War is waste. Dead bodies are waste. Ruined cities are waste. We prefer to build, but make no mistake. If you force our hand, if you threaten Earth or our allies again, we will not send a ship. We will send the whole sector, and we won't stop until your empire is just more scrap for our foundries." The connection cut. The hologram vanished. The room was plunged back into the dim atmospheric lighting, but the shadows no longer felt oppressive. They felt empty. The silence that followed was not the silence of fear, but the silence of a paradigm shifting, of a great wheel turning in the cosmos, crushing the old ways beneath its rim. But the story did not end with the humiliation of the Ethelgard. That would have been simple. That would have been merely a shift in political power. What happened next, in the weeks and months that followed the arrival of the Resolute, revealed that the conflict between human and alien was merely the prelude to a much darker symphony. The Ethelgard, crippled by the loss of face and the growing independence of their vassals, attempted to negotiate. They invited human delegations to the Synod, not as petitioners, but as equals. The humans accepted, though they walked the halls of the obsidian spire with the wary grace of wolves entering a dog kennel. They shared technology, cautiously. They explained how they had stabilized the singularities in the Blight. They spoke of harmonic resonance and quantum stitching, concepts the Ethelgard scientists scoffed at until the math was proven irrefutable. It was during one of these diplomatic summits, 3 months after the Resolute incident, that the true nature of the wreck was revealed. Ambassador Thorn sat with High Counselor Vrexian in a private chamber. The mood was tense but functional. They were discussing trade routes. "There is something I must ask," Vrexian said, pouring a cup of viscous, ceremonial nectar for the human. It was a gesture of supreme respect, one he loathed performing but knew was necessary. "The energy output of your bastion, it fluctuates. There are spikes, rhythmic spikes. Our scientists believe you are testing a weapon. I must warn you if you are building a planet killer." Thorn took the cup, inspecting the liquid but not drinking. "It's not a weapon, Vrexian, not in the way you think." "Then what is it? A generator, a beacon?" Thorn set the cup down. "Do you know why the precursor civilization fell, the ones who built the swarm you gave us?" "Madness," Vrexian dismissed. "Biological degradation, civil war, the usual fate of those who lack the discipline of the Ethelgard." "No," Thorn said softly. "They didn't die of madness, they were killed. We found their records deep in the core of the central star, inside the data monoliths you were too afraid to excavate. They were fighting something. The swarm wasn't a habitat, it was a cage." Vrexian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "A cage? For what?" "For what's outside," Thorn replied. He tapped the table and a small holographic emitter projected a star map. It showed the galaxy and then it zoomed out to the dark, empty void between galaxies. "The precursors called them the Hollow Ones, entropic entities, beings of pure anti-energy that feed on complexity. They hate structure, they hate life, they hate us." Thorn pointed to the sector of space where the Blight was located. "The precursors built the sphere to generate a signal, a chaotic non-Euclidean noise that acted as a camouflage. It masked this region of the galaxy from the Hollow Ones. When the sphere broke, the camouflage failed. But the radiation, the rot, as you called it, was so intense it acted as a secondary barrier. When you gave it to us and we started fixing it, we stopped the rad." "Annihilation." Vrexian stared at the human. You turned off the shield." "We turned off the noise," Thorn corrected. "And we turned on the weapon. The precursors died before they could finish it. They left the wreck because they ran out of time. They tried to hide. It didn't work. We realized that hiding doesn't work. If you stay in the dark, the monsters just eat you last." "So," Avrexian's voice trembled, "you fixed the cage." "No," Thorn said, his eyes locking onto the alien S. "We opened the door." The shock hit Vrexian like a physical blow. "You what?" "We finished the gun, Vrexian. The rhythmic spikes you see? That's the targeting sequence. We're not aiming at you. We're aiming out. We're pinging the void. We're telling them we're here." "You are insane." Vrexian stood up, overturning the table. "You have doomed us all. You have invited the destroyers of the precursors to our doorstep." "They were coming anyway," Thorn said, remaining seated, calm as a mountain. The background static of the universe is changing. We measured it. They've been drifting this way for 10,000 years. They would have arrived in a century, maybe two. And they would have found a galaxy of stagnant empires fighting over scraps, terrified of their own shadows. They would have eaten us alive one by one. Thorn stood up then, and for the first time Vrexian saw not just a soldier but a guardian. "You gave us a wreck," Thorn said. "We turned it into a fortress, but a fortress needs a siege. We realized that as long as the galaxy is divided, as long as you sit on your throne oppressing your vassals and we sit in our corner hoarding our tech, we lose. We need unity, and nothing creates unity like a monster at the gates." You summoned them to force an alliance?" Vrexian gasped, horrified by the scale of the gamble. "I summoned them because we are ready," Thorn said, "and because you need to be. The Resolute isn't the only ship we built. We have thousands, but we need your logistics, we need your fleets. We need the resources of the Ethelgard, not as masters, but as allies." Thorn walked to the window, looking out at the violet sky of the alien world. "The signal went out 3 days ago. They are coming. The sensors on the perimeter are already screaming. The annihilation isn't what we did to the wreck, Vrexian. It's what we are going to do to the dark." The High Counselor stood in the ruin of his private chamber, his mind racing. He looked at the human, this short-lived, reckless, terrifying creature. He thought of the history of the Ethelgard, centuries of peace bought with stagnation. And then he thought of the void, the hunger that was approaching. He realized that the human was right. The Ethelgard would have died in their sleep. The humans had kicked down the door and woken them up with a slap to the face. "What do you need?" Vrexian asked, his voice low. Thorn turned back and the smile on his face was grim, but it held a spark of something that looked dangerously like hope. "Everything," he said. "We need everything. Metal, plasma, bodies, minds. The bastion is strong, but it's the anvil. You need to be the hammer." The alliance that formed in the following weeks was not born of friendship. It was born of terror and necessity. The Ethelgard bureaucracy, once a tool of oppression, was repurposed into the most efficient wartime logistics machine the galaxy had ever seen. The vassal states were freed, not out of kindness, but because every species needed to fight. The humans shared the precursor tech freely now, outfitting Ethelgard ships with shields that could withstand the entropy fire of the Hollow Ones. And when they arrived, when the sky tore open not with the clean blue of hyperspace, but with the festering black rot of the anti-void, the galaxy was waiting. The Hollow Ones were nightmares made manifest, geometry that hurt to look at, shadows that drank light. They poured into the system by the millions, a tide of silence meant to extinguish the stars. They expected prey. They expected fear. They expected a chaotic, divided galaxy that would shatter at the first touch. Instead, they met the wall. Sector 90, the Terran bastion, flared to life. The Dyson rings, fully repaired and spinning at relativistic speeds, unleashed a beam of focused, coherent energy that was visible from the other side of the spiral arm. It struck the vanguard of the Hollow Ones and vaporized them instantly, burning a hole in the darkness. Then came the fleets. The heavy, brutal ships of the Terrans, taking the hits, their armor buckling but holding, their kinetic batteries pounding a rhythm of defiance. And flanking them, the sleek, swift armadas of the Ethelgard and their allies, weaving through the chaos, delivering precision strikes, covering the human flanks, acting as the scalpel to the human sledgehammer. On the bridge of the Resolute, Admiral Thorn watched the battle map. The losses were high. Ships were dying. Thousands of lives were being snuffed out every second. But the line was holding. For the first time in galactic history, the line was holding against the dark. A channel opened. It was Vrexian, commanding from the flagship Eternal Spire. His carapace was cracked, and green ichor leaked from a wound on his head, but his eyes burned with a ferocity that had been absent for an epoch. "Admiral," Vrexian shouted over the roar of battle. "The left flank is buckling. The Hollow Ones are pushing for the bastion's primary emitter." "I see them," Thorn replied, his hands flying over the tactical console. "We're diverting the 7th Fleet to intercept. Hold your position, Counselor. Don't let them break the formation." "We will not break," Vrexian roared back, a sound that was pure primal rage. "We are the Ethelgard. We do not break, we annihilate." Thorn smiled. It was a bloody, terrible smile. "That's the spirit. All ships. Focus fire on coordinates 390, light them up, show them why they should have stayed in the dark." The combined fire of a united galaxy converged on the breach. It was a lance of pure will, a declaration of existence screamed into the void. The darkness recoiled. The Hollow Ones shrieked, a psychic scream that bled from the comms, and then, for the first time in their timeless existence, they retreated. They found that the prey had teeth. They found that the garden was guarded. As the enemy fleet broke and fled back into the deep void, battered and reduced, a cheer went up across the comms network. It was a cacophony of 1,000 languages, a dissonant, beautiful roar of survival. Thorn slumped back in his command chair, the adrenaline fading, leaving him shaking. He looked at the view screen, at the debris of the battle. There was wreckage everywhere. Human ships, Ethelgard ships, the twisted remains of the enemy. It was a graveyard. Admiral, Vrexian's voice came through, quieter now. They are retreating, we have won. For today, Thorn said. They'll be back, maybe in a year, maybe in 1,000, but they'll be back. Let them come, Vrexian said, and in his voice there was no arrogance, only a cold, hard resolve. We will be here, we have much work to do, the wreckage, it will need to be cleared. We can use it, Thorn said automatically. The enemy hulls. The alloy is strange, but if we reconfigure the molecular bonding. Vrexian laughed. It was a dry, clicking sound, but it was genuine. Always the scavenger, Thorn. You look at a battlefield and see a hardware store. I look at a battlefield and see the future, Thorn replied. You gave us a wreck, Vrexian, and we gave you a war, but together. I think we just gave the universe a reason to be afraid of the light. The camera pulled back, away from the bridge of the Resolute, away from the battered fleet, away from the glowing, defiant ring of the Terran bastion. It drifted out into the silence of the cosmos, where the stars burned a little brighter, and the darkness, for the first time, seemed a little less absolute. The galaxy had changed. The old empire was dead, annihilated by the truth. In its place stood something new, something forged in rust and blood and unity. A wreck had been given, and from it, a sword had been drawn. And the hand that held it was no longer human or alien, but something greater than both. The philosophical implications of the victory rippled outward faster than the news of the battle itself. On Ethelgard, the rigid caste system began to fracture, not from revolution, but from the undeniable reality that the lesser castes had fought and died with as much valor as the high ones. On Earth, the xenophobia that had simmered since first contact evaporated, replaced by a grim respect for the aliens who had stood their ground when the void opened up. The wreck became a symbol. It appeared in art, in speeches, in the religious texts of a dozen worlds. It represented the idea that nothing is truly lost, nothing is truly broken, as long as there is a will to mend it. But deep in the heart of the bastion, in the command center that had once been the control room of a dead precursor king, Thorn and Vrexian stood overlooking the core. It was a swirling vortex of energy, the captured heart of the Hollow One's vanguard, trapped and repurposed to power the next generation of shields. You know, Vrexian said, watching the energy swirl, there is an old Ethelgard proverb, perfection is the enemy of progress. We forgot that. We sought perfection and we found stagnation. You humans, you are messy, you are chaotic, you are terrifyingly imperfect. Thorn nodded, watching the readout. Imperfection allows for change, Vrexian. If you're perfect, you can't get better. If you're broken, well, then the only way is up. Annihilation, Vrexian mused, testing the word again. I thought it meant the end, but perhaps it means the removal of the unnecessary. You annihilated our fear. You annihilated our isolation. We annihilated the silence, Thorn said. He turned to the alien, extending a hand, a human gesture that Vrexian had learned to mimic. And now we have a lot of noise to make. Vrexian took the hand, his chitinous claw wrapped around the human flesh. It was cold meeting warm, ancient meeting new, rigid meeting adaptable. Yes, the High Counselor agreed. Let us make some noise. And in the dark the universe listened, and for the first time it held its breath. The wreckage was no more, the weapon was primed, and the pilots were ready. The story of the gift was over. The story of the alliance had just begun. The stars were no longer cold, distant points of light. They were fires lit by those who refused to go gently into the good night. They were the eyes of the new guardians, watching the dark, daring it to blink. The end,